one choice, one moment, one love story. Welcome to When He Chose Her. Enjoy the story. Make her dance, and I'll double the bill. The words cut through the soft jazz like a careless laugh, light, expensive, and just loud enough to turn heads. And for a brief moment, the entire restaurant seemed to lean toward the table where Alexander Hayes sat, his fingers resting calmly against a crystal glass, his expression unreadable, as if the world around him was nothing more than background noise he had long ago learned to ignore. And across the polished floor, Isabella Carter paused mid-step, a single drop of red wine trembling at the edge of her tray before falling onto the white linen like a quiet mistake that didn't belong in a place like this. And someone chuckled, then another, until the sound grew into something sharper, something that carried the familiar weight of judgment. But she didn't rush, didn't apologize more than necessary, didn't shrink the way they expected. She simply set the glass down, reached for a cloth, and wiped the stain with steady hands. Her eyes lowered, but not broken, not even slightly. And that was the first thing Alexander noticed. Not the spill, not the laughter, but the stillness, the way she didn't perform embarrassment for their comfort, the way she refused to turn herself into a spectacle even when they were already treating her like one. And he tilted his head just slightly, curious, though he would never call it that, because curiosity implied interest, and interest was something he reserved for things that could be measured, acquired, controlled, and she, at first glance, seemed like none of those things, just another waitress in a city full of them, moving between tables, carrying plates, invisible by design. And yet, when one of his associates leaned back in his chair and gestured toward her with a lazy grin, saying, "Come on, sweetheart. You heard the man. Dance for us. Let's see if you're worth the extra tip." Something shifted, not in the room, not yet, but in the space between expectation and refusal. And for a second, it looked like she might ignore him, might walk away the way most would, choosing silence over confrontation, dignity over attention. But then she stopped, slowly, deliberately, and turned, her gaze lifting just enough to meet the edge of the table, not the men themselves, just the space they occupied, as if acknowledging the moment without surrendering to it. And someone snorted, "What? You don't know how?" And that was when Alexander finally spoke, not loudly, not forcefully, just a quiet, almost amused, "If she doesn't want to, let it go." But there was no real defense in it, no protection, just observation, the kind that kept his hands clean while still allowing the scene to unfold. And Isabella heard it. Of course she did. The tone, the distance, the way he placed himself just outside the situation as if he were above it. And for the first time, her eyes lifted fully, meeting his for a fraction of a second, long enough to register something there. Not kindness, not cruelty, just detachment. And then she looked away, set the tray down on the nearest empty table, and stepped forward, not toward them, but toward the open space between tables where the light pooled just slightly brighter. And someone laughed again, thinking they had won, thinking this was entertainment, a small victory bought with money and boredom. But Isabella didn't move like someone performing for approval. She stood still, centered, her shoulders relaxed, her breath slow. And when the music changed, when the soft jazz faded and a sharp, unmistakable tango rhythm filled the room, it wasn't clear who had started it, only that it fit her in a way nothing else had. And she closed her eyes for half a second, just long enough to remember something the room could not see, something older than this moment, something that had nothing to do with tips or tables or men who thought they could buy a piece of her with a careless bet. And then she opened them, and everything shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough that the laughter faltered, just enough that the air grew still, and Alexander leaned back slightly, his glass forgotten in his hand, because suddenly, this wasn't about a waitress being mocked anymore. This was something else, something he hadn't anticipated, something he couldn't quite name yet. And for the first time that evening, he wasn't watching out of habit. He was watching because he didn't understand what was about to happen next. The first step did not look like a performance. It looked like a decision, her heel pressing softly against the polished floor as if testing whether the ground beneath her would hold. And then it did, and she moved, not fast, not flashy, just precise, her body aligning with the rhythm in a way that felt less like dancing and more like remembering. And the room reacted in fragments, a chair scraping, a glass pausing midair, a breath caught halfway. Because this was no longer entertainment. This was control, quiet and undeniable. And Alexander felt it before he understood it, the subtle shift in power that did not announce itself but settled into the space like a truth everyone suddenly recognized but could not explain. And his associate, the one who had made the joke, leaned forward with a half-smile that slowly faded as Isabella turned, her movements sharp but effortless, every step landing exactly where it needed to be, not a fraction of an inch off, not a single hesitation. And it was not perfection that made it compelling. It was intention, the kind that could not be faked, the kind that came from years, from discipline, from something built long before this moment and carried quietly into it. And someone near the bar whispered, "That is not normal." And another voice answered, softer, "That is not learned in a diner." And Alexander's gaze narrowed slightly, not in judgment, but in focus, because now he was searching, analyzing, trying to place her within a framework he understood, but she did not fit, not neatly, not logically, and that unsettled him more than he would admit. And as the music deepened, her steps followed, sharper now, more defined, her posture lifting, her chin angling just enough to change the entire line of her silhouette, transforming her from someone who served into someone who commanded. And it was subtle, almost invisible if you were not looking for it. But once seen, it could not be ignored, and the laughter that had filled the room minutes ago was gone, replaced by something heavier, something closer to respect, though no one said the word out loud. And then, without warning, she pivoted, a clean, controlled turn that stopped exactly on the beat, her foot landing with a soft echo that seemed louder than it should have been. And for a moment, complete stillness, the kind that made people aware of their own breathing, their own presence in a space that suddenly felt different. And Alexander realized, with a clarity that surprised him, that he had not taken a sip from his glass in several minutes, his attention fully captured, not by beauty, not by novelty, but by something far more unsettling, authenticity, the kind that did not ask for approval and therefore did not need it. And he leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the table now, no longer detached, no longer observing from a distance, because distance no longer felt possible. And as Isabella moved again, faster this time, the rhythm building, her steps weaving across the floor with a confidence that bordered on defiance, he saw it. Not just the skill, but the history behind it, the hours, the choices, the sacrifices that must have led her here. And for the first time that evening, a thought crossed his mind that he could not immediately dismiss. "Who are you?" And it lingered there, unanswered, as the music carried on, as she continued to move with a precision that made the room feel smaller, quieter, more focused, until even the staff had stopped pretending to work, their eyes drawn to the same center point, the same figure who had been invisible just moments ago, and now held every gaze without trying, without asking, without even looking at them. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, she slowed, her steps softening, her breathing steady, her posture lowering slightly as if the performance was folding back into itself. And for a brief second, it seemed like it might end there, clean, contained, a moment that would pass and leave behind only the memory of something unexpected. But Alexander did not move, did not look away, because something in him understood that this was not finished, not yet, and he found himself waiting, not for the end, but for whatever came next, even if he could not define what that was. The music did not end. It lingered, stretching into the silence she created, and Isabella held that silence like it belonged to her, her chest rising once, controlled, measured, before she took a final step backward, not a retreat, but a conclusion, her heel landing softly as if placing a period at the end of a sentence no one else knew how to write. And for a moment, no one moved, not a single clap, not a whisper, just the quiet weight of realization, settling over a room that had expected amusement and received something else entirely, something that could not be laughed at. And then, slowly, the first sound returned, not applause, not yet, but a breath, a shift, the subtle recognition that whatever had just happened could not be undone. And Isabella did not bow, did not smile for approval. She simply turned, just as she had before, and reached for her tray as if the last few minutes had been nothing more than a brief interruption in her shift. And that, more than anything, unsettled Alexander, because power, real power, did not linger for validation. It moved on, and he watched her as she resumed her work, her posture returning to something smaller, quieter, but not diminished, never diminished, and one of his associates finally broke the silence with an awkward laugh. Well, that was something, but the words felt empty, like they did not belong to what had just taken place. And another man cleared his throat, reaching for his drink as if normalcy could be restored by routine. But Alexander did not reach for anything. He remained still, his gaze following Isabella as she moved from table to table, unnoticed again by most, invisible by choice. And that contrast, that sudden shift from center stage to background, did not make sense to him, because in his world, value demanded attention. It held it, it capitalized on it. And yet she had just walked away from it without hesitation, without even a glance back. And that was not something he could categorize, not something he could quantify. And he did not like that, not because it threatened him, but because it challenged the structure he relied on, the predictable exchange between worth and recognition. And for the first time in a long time, Alexander felt something unfamiliar, not confusion exactly, but a gap in understanding. And he stood, slowly, the movement drawing a few glances, his presence still commanding in the way it always had been. But now, there was something different in his expression, something less certain, and he adjusted his jacket out of habit, though there was nothing to fix, and stepped away from the table, ignoring the questioning look from his associate who had started the bet. And as he crossed the room, the distance between him and Isabella seemed longer than it should have been, not measured in feet, but in something less tangible, something shaped by everything that had just happened, and she did not notice him at first, or perhaps she did and chose not to react, continuing to place a plate in front of another guest with the same steady precision, the same quiet professionalism. And when she finally turned, their eyes met again, not by accident this time, but by choice, and he stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak without raising his voice, and for a second, neither of them said anything, the noise of the restaurant returning around them, but somehow distant, like it existed outside the moment they were standing in. And Alexander was the first to break the silence, his voice lower than before, stripped of the casual detachment he had worn so easily earlier. That was not part of your job description, and it was not a compliment, not exactly, more an observation, a statement that carried the weight of everything he did not yet understand. And Isabella held his gaze for a brief moment, her expression calm, unreadable, before she responded, her voice soft but steady. Neither was being laughed at, and the words landed without force, without accusation, but with a clarity that left no room for deflection, and Alexander felt it. The shift, subtle but undeniable, the moment where control did not belong entirely to him anymore. And instead of responding immediately, he studied her, not her uniform, not her role, but her, the person, standing in front of him who had just altered the atmosphere of an entire room without raising her voice, without asking for permission. And for the first time, he did not have a ready answer, did not have a strategy, and that absence of certainty did not irritate him the way it normally would. It intrigued him, quietly, persistently, like a question that refused to be dismissed, and Isabella did not wait for his reply. She simply nodded once, a small, polite acknowledgement, and stepped past him, returning to her work, leaving him standing there for a fraction of a second longer than he intended. And as she moved away, Alexander realized something he had not expected to feel, not admiration, not yet, but respect, the kind that did not announce itself, the kind that grew in silence. And for a man who had built his life on control, on knowing, on always being one step ahead, it was a strange and unfamiliar place to stand, watching someone who had just changed the rules without ever saying a word. Alexander did not return to his seat right away, which in itself was unusual, because he was a man who followed patterns, who completed cycles, who did not leave things unfinished, and yet he stood there for a moment longer than necessary, watching Isabella move through the room as if nothing had changed, as if she had not just shifted the balance of an entire space with nothing more than a few measured steps and a refusal to be small. And when he finally turned back toward his table, the conversation had already restarted, though it felt thinner now, forced in places, like laughter that arrived half a second too late. and his associate raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing at the edge of his mouth. You going to recruit her next, Alex? Or was that just part of the show? And Alexander did not answer immediately. He simply sat down, reached for his glass, and this time actually took a sip, the familiar burn grounding him in something predictable, something he could control. But the question lingered, not the words themselves, but the implication behind them, the assumption that everything, everyone, could be categorized, evaluated, acquired. And he set the glass down carefully, his tone calm but quieter than before. She is not part of anything. And the table fell silent for a brief second, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. And then someone laughed, trying to recover the earlier tone. Relax, it was a joke. But Alexander did not smile, did not engage, his attention already elsewhere, already tracking something beyond the immediate conversation. And as the evening moved forward, courses were served, deals were discussed, numbers exchanged in low voices that carried the weight of millions. But for the first time in a long time, Alexander found himself only half present, his responses automatic, precise, but lacking the usual sharpness that defined him. And every so often, his gaze drifted, not obviously, not in a way that would draw attention, but enough that he remained aware of Isabella's presence, the way she moved, the way she interacted with other guests, always composed, always measured, never seeking attention yet, never shrinking from it when it found her. And it created a quiet tension in him, not discomfort, but a kind of curiosity that refused to settle. And when the check finally arrived, placed neatly at the edge of the table, he reached for it without hesitation, his signature quick, decisive, as it always was. But this time, instead of simply standing and leaving, he paused, just briefly, before sliding an additional note inside the folder, not excessive, not performative, just enough to acknowledge something without turning it into a transaction. And when Isabella returned to collect it, their interaction was brief, professional, exactly what it should have been. And yet, as she opened the folder, her eyes flicked over the amount for only a fraction of a second before she looked back at him, not with gratitude, not with surprise, but with something closer to understanding, as if she recognized the intent behind the gesture and chose to accept it without making it more than it was. And she nodded once, a simple acknowledgement, "Thank you, sir," and turned to leave. But Alexander spoke before she could take more than a step, his voice low, controlled, but carrying something new beneath it, something that did not belong to habit. "Do you always walk away that easily?" And it was an unusual question, one that did not fit the context, one that revealed more than he intended. And Isabella stopped, not immediately, but after a single step, as if considering whether the question deserved a response at all. And when she turned back, her expression remained calm, but there was a slight tilt to her head, a subtle shift that suggested she was now the one evaluating him. "From what?" she asked, and Alexander held her gaze, aware that this was no longer a simple exchange, aware that whatever answer he gave would not be taken at face value. "From being seen," he said finally, the words quieter than expected, more honest than he was used to offering. And for a moment, she did not respond, her eyes steady, searching, as if measuring the space between what he said and what he meant. And then, almost imperceptibly, her lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, not warm, not distant, just real. "You assumed that was the first time." And the answer landed differently than he anticipated, not as a challenge, not as a dismissal, but as a simple statement of fact that shifted the entire premise of his question. And before he could respond, before he could reframe or redirect, she turned again and walked away, leaving him with something he was not accustomed to holding, a conversation that did not end on his terms. And as he stood, adjusting his jacket once more, preparing to leave, he realized that this evening, which had begun as nothing more than another routine engagement, another predictable sequence of events, had become something else entirely. Something that extended beyond the walls of the restaurant, beyond the brief intersection of their roles. And as he stepped out into the cool night air, the city stretching out before him in familiar lines of light and movement, he found himself thinking not about the deals he had closed or the conversations he had controlled, but about a single question that had not yet been answered, and for perhaps the first time in years. He did not immediately try to solve it. He simply let it remain, unresolved, quietly present, like a rhythm he could still hear even after the music had stopped. The night air was colder than Alexander expected, sharper somehow, as if the city itself had shifted while he was inside. And he stood for a moment on the curb, his driver already pulling up, the familiar black car gliding to a stop with quiet precision. But he did not move immediately, his gaze drifting upward along the glass towers that defined his world, structures he had built, influenced, dominated. And yet none of them explained what had just happened, none of them accounted for the quiet disruption caused by a woman who carried plates for a living and walked away from attention like it had never mattered. And that was the part that stayed with him, not the dance itself, not even the skill, but the absence of need, the way she had not tried to turn that moment into something more, something profitable, something advantageous. And as he finally stepped into the car, the door closing with a soft, final sound, he gave a simple instruction, "Office," his voice steady, controlled. But his mind already elsewhere, replaying fragments, not in sequence, but in feeling, the stillness before she moved, the way the room had shifted, the look in her eyes when she answered him. And for a man who processed information quickly, efficiently, it was frustrating in a way he could not quite name, because this did not resolve into a clear conclusion. It lingered, and when he arrived at his office, the building nearly empty at this hour, the lights dimmed to a quiet glow that reflected off polished surfaces, he walked through the space with the same confidence he always had, his footsteps measured, his presence unmistakable. But even here, in the center of his control, something felt slightly off, not wrong, just incomplete, and he loosened his tie as he entered his office, setting his phone down on the desk, the city stretching out behind him in a wide expanse of light and motion. And for a few seconds, he simply stood there, hands resting against the edge of the desk, looking out without really seeing, until his assistant's voice echoed faintly in his memory. A detail from earlier in the week, a report, a list of staffing changes in one of the restaurants his company had recently acquired, and the connection formed quietly, almost reluctantly, and he turned, reaching for his phone again, his movements more deliberate now, more focused, and within seconds, he had the information pulled up, scanning quickly, efficiently, until he found it. The name, Isabella Carter, and there was something almost absurd about seeing it there, reduced to text on a screen, categorized, filed, as if that could contain what he had witnessed, and he exhaled slowly, not frustration, not quite, more like acknowledgement, and pressed a call, the line connecting almost immediately. "I need the full background on an employee," he said, his tone calm, but carrying that unmistakable edge that meant the request was not optional. Restaurant division, Midtown location. And there was a pause on the other end, the kind that came with processing, with recognition. "Of course, Mr. Hayes." "Name?" And he hesitated for a fraction of a second, not because he did not remember, but because saying it out loud felt like crossing a line he had not yet defined. "Isabella Carter." And as the call ended, he set the phone down again, his gaze returning to the window. But this time there was something different in it, not just observation, but intention, and across the city, in a small apartment that did not reflect the kind of life people assumed when they saw what she could do. Isabella sat at a narrow kitchen table, her shoes placed neatly beside her, the faint marks of wear visible along the edges, her fingers resting lightly against them as if they held more than just fabric and stitching. And the room was quiet, the kind of quiet that came after a long day, after too many expectations, too many moments that required control. And she leaned back slightly, her eyes closing for a second, not in exhaustion, but in thought, replaying the evening not for validation, not for regret, but simply to understand what it had been, what it had changed. And when her phone buzzed softly against the table, she glanced at it, a message from her manager, brief, neutral, "Good work tonight." And she allowed herself a small smile, not because of the words, but because of how little they mattered compared to everything else, and she set the phone aside, her attention returning to the shoes, to the quiet reminder of a life she had not abandoned, only paused. And somewhere across the city, in an office filled with certainty, Alexander Hayes stood looking out at a skyline he had always understood, and for the first time, realized there was something in it he had missed entirely, something that did not belong to his world, and yet had just stepped into it without permission, without warning, and refused to be ignored. The next morning did not wait for clarity. It arrived with the same precision the city always had, sunlight cutting between buildings, traffic moving in steady lines, people stepping into their routines as if nothing had shifted, and in his office, Alexander Hayes sat behind a desk that had seen decisions worth millions, his posture composed, his expression neutral. But the file open in front of him was not one he had expected to matter, not like this, and he read it once, then again, not because it was long, but because it was incomplete in a way that did not make sense. Isabella Carter, employment history minimal, no formal record of professional dance training, no affiliations, no awards, no trace of the kind of background that could explain what he had seen, and he leaned back slightly, fingers steepled, eyes narrowing just enough to signal thought rather than judgment, because this was a gap. And gaps meant either something missing or something hidden, and he was not a man who ignored either. And yet, as he stared at the screen, he realized something unusual. He was not searching for leverage, not looking for a way to use the information. He was trying to understand, and that distinction, though subtle, shifted the entire purpose of the exercise, and he closed the file slowly, not because he was finished, but because he recognized that whatever answer he was looking for was not going to be found in a report. And across the city, Isabella stood in a narrow dance studio that smelled faintly of wood and time, the mirrors along the wall reflecting a version of her that few people ever saw, her hair pulled back, her posture different, stronger, more open, as if the space itself allowed her to exist without shrinking. And the music was low, almost private, a rhythm that filled the room without demanding attention. And she moved, not performing, not proving, just practicing. Her steps slower than the night before, more deliberate, each motion refined, adjusted, repeated until it felt right. And there was no audience here, no expectation, only the quiet discipline of someone who had not forgotten, someone who had simply chosen when to reveal it. And she paused after a turn, her breath steady, her reflection meeting her gaze. And for a second, there was something softer in her expression, not doubt, not regret, just a quiet acknowledgement of the distance between who she had been and who she was now. And when the studio door opened with a soft creak, she did not turn immediately, assuming it was the owner, someone who had long ago learned not to ask too many questions. But the footsteps were different, measured, unfamiliar, and when she did turn, it was not with surprise, but with awareness, because standing in the doorway, slightly out of place in a space that did not belong to him, was Alexander Hayes, his suit still precise, his presence still controlled. But there was something different in the way he stood, less certain, less anchored, as if the room had shifted the rules without informing him. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the music continuing softly in the background, filling the silence without breaking it. And then he stepped forward, just enough to close the distance slightly, his voice lower than it had been the night before, not carrying authority, but intention. "You are difficult to find." And it was not an accusation, not even a complaint, more an observation that carried the weight of effort. And Isabella studied him for a second, her expression unreadable, before responding. "You were not supposed to." And there was no defensiveness in her tone, only truth, simple and direct. And Alexander exhaled quietly, a small shift that might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but not by her, because she had already learned to read what people did not say. And he glanced briefly around the studio, the mirrors, the worn floor, the absence of luxury, of status, of anything that could be bought or controlled, and then back at her. "You are not just a waitress." And this time, it was not a question, not even a statement meant to provoke. It was recognition. And Isabella held his gaze, her posture steady, her voice calm. "And you are not just a man who watches." And the words landed with quiet precision, not challenging, not dismissing, but reframing the entire dynamic between them. And for a moment, Alexander did not respond, not because he could not, but because he chose not to, because for the first time, he understood that this was not a conversation he could lead in the way he was used to. And instead, he stepped slightly to the side, not taking control of the space, but making room within it. And the music continued, soft, steady, waiting, And in that moment, something shifted again, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that the distance between them felt different, less defined by roles, less controlled by expectation, and more by something neither of them had fully named yet, but both had begun to recognize. The music did not stop when he stepped aside. It continued as if it had been waiting for that exact moment, and Isabella watched him for a second longer, measuring not his words but his position, the subtle shift from control to invitation, and without saying anything, she moved again, her foot sliding back into place, her posture lifting as the rhythm reclaimed her. But this time, it was different, not a performance, not a memory replayed for an unseen audience, but something shared, even if neither of them had agreed to it out loud. And Alexander remained where he was for a breath longer than necessary, his instinct telling him to observe, to analyze, to remain outside the moment the way he always had. But something in the quiet certainty of her movement made that distance feel artificial, unnecessary. And when she turned slightly, her eyes meeting his just long enough to signal expectation rather than request, he understood, not fully, not comfortably, but enough. And he stepped forward, not with confidence, not with the practiced control he carried into boardrooms and negotiations, but with a hesitation so rare it almost surprised him. And the first step was wrong, slightly off, his timing misaligned with the music, and if anyone else had been there, they might have laughed, might have pointed out the flaw in a man who seemed to excel at everything else. But there was no audience here, only the quiet echo of the studio and the steady rhythm that did not adjust for him. And Isabella did not correct him immediately. She allowed the mistake to exist for a second, long enough for him to feel it, to recognize it. And then she spoke, her voice soft but precise. "Do not think, just listen." And it was a simple instruction, but for a man like Alexander, it was almost impossible, because thinking was what he did, constantly, instinctively. But he tried, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to shift his focus from control to awareness. And when he moved again, it was still imperfect, still slightly off, but closer, and Isabella stepped in, not leading, not dominating, but guiding, her hand lightly indicating direction, her presence steady without being overwhelming. And for the first time, Alexander experienced something he had not felt in years, not failure, but learning, the kind that required him to let go of certainty, to accept that he was not the strongest, not the most skilled, not the one in control, and instead of resisting it, he allowed it, just enough to continue. And as the music carried them forward, the space between them shifted again, no longer defined by distance or hierarchy, but by rhythm, by timing, by the subtle exchange of movement that required both of them to be present in the same way. And Isabella noticed it, the moment his shoulders relaxed slightly, the moment his steps began to follow rather than force. And there was a quiet acknowledgement in her expression, not approval, but recognition, and she adjusted her own movement to meet him there, not lowering herself, but aligning just enough to create balance. And the studio, which had felt empty when he entered, now felt full, not with sound or people, but with something harder to define, something that existed between intention and action. And when the music slowed, she did not stop immediately. She allowed the final notes to settle, her movement softening gradually until stillness returned. And this time, the silence felt different, not heavy, not uncertain, but complete. And Alexander stood there for a second, his breath slightly uneven, not from exertion, but from the unfamiliar experience of not being entirely in control. And he let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it, just acknowledgement. "I am not good at this," he said, the words simple, unguarded, and Isabella tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. "You are not used to it," she corrected, and the distinction mattered, more than he expected, because it suggested something temporary, something that could change. And he considered that for a moment, his eyes drifting briefly to the mirror, catching a reflection of himself that looked different from the one he was accustomed to seeing, less composed, less controlled, but somehow more present. And when he looked back at her, there was something new in his expression, not confidence, not yet, but willingness. "Then I suppose I will have to learn." And the words were not a declaration, not a challenge, just a quiet statement of intent. And Isabella held his gaze for a second longer before nodding once, a small, almost imperceptible agreement. And as the music began again, softer this time, less structured, they moved once more, not perfectly, not seamlessly, but together. And for a man who had spent his life leading, it was the first time he understood the value of following, not as weakness, but as trust. And for a woman who had learned to move alone, it was the first time she allowed someone else into that space without losing herself. And in that quiet studio, far from the noise of the world they both knew, something began to take shape, not defined, not spoken, but real enough to feel, and neither of them tried to name it, not yet. Days did not pass the way they used to. They shifted, subtly at first. Then with a rhythm Alexander began to recognize, a pattern not dictated by meetings or markets, but by something far less predictable. And yet he found himself adjusting to it without resistance, returning to the studio not out of obligation, not even out of curiosity anymore, but because it had become a place where he did not need to perform certainty. And Isabella noticed it before he said anything, the way his steps grew quieter when he entered, the way his shoulders no longer carried the same rigid precision, and she did not acknowledge it directly. She simply moved into position, letting the music begin before any conversation could shape the moment. And this time, he followed without being told, his steps still imperfect, still occasionally misaligned, but no longer forced, no longer controlled by the need to be right, and she adjusted to him, not correcting every mistake, not guiding every motion, allowing space for him to find the rhythm on his own. And that space became something they both learned to trust, a quiet understanding that did not require words. And when the music slowed, they did not stop immediately. They stood there for a second, closer than before, not out of necessity, but because neither of them stepped away. And it was Isabella who broke the stillness first, not with movement, but with a question, her voice softer than usual, almost reflective. "Why are you really here?" And Alexander did not answer right away, not because he did not know, but because the answer did not fit into the kind of explanation he was used to giving. And he exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting briefly to the mirrored wall before returning to her. "Because I do not understand you," he said finally, the honesty in it unpolished, unexpected, and Isabella held his gaze, her expression unchanged. But there was something in her eyes that softened just slightly, not in response to the words themselves, but to the way he said them, and she nodded once, a small acknowledgement. "Most people do not try," she replied, and there was no pride in it, no distance, just a statement that carried years of experience behind it. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer uncertain, but steady, and Alexander shifted slightly, not stepping back, not closing the distance, just enough to change the angle of the moment. "And if I do understand," he asked, his voice quieter now, more careful, "what happens then?" And it was not a challenge, not a negotiation, just a question that did not have a clear outcome, and Isabella considered it, her gaze dropping briefly before returning to him. "Then you will stop looking for a version of me that fits your world," she said, and the words landed with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation, and Alexander absorbed that, not defensively, not dismissively, but thoughtfully, because for the first time, he recognized the pattern she was pointing to, the instinct to categorize, to define, to shape things into something that could be understood within his own structure, and he nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in recognition. And when the music started again, it felt different, not just a rhythm to follow, but a conversation, one that unfolded through movement instead of words. And this time, when he stepped forward, he did not hesitate, and when she turned, he matched her, not perfectly, not seamlessly, but with intention. And there was a moment, brief but unmistakable, where everything aligned, their steps, their timing, the space between them, and it did not last long. It did not need to, because it was enough to change something, something neither of them had named yet, but both had begun to feel. And when the music ended, they did not hold the silence the same way as before. It was lighter now, less weighted by uncertainty, and Alexander let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh again, though this time it carried a different meaning. "I am improving," he said, and Isabella allowed herself a small smile, not wide, not obvious, but real. "You are listening," she corrected, and the distinction mattered, more than he expected. because it shifted the focus from skill to awareness, from performance to presence. And as they stepped apart, the distance between them no longer felt like separation, but like space, intentional, chosen. And when he moved toward the door, pausing briefly before leaving, he did not look back immediately, not because he did not want to, but because he understood that some moments did not need to be held on as so tightly. And when he finally did glance over his shoulder, she was already moving again, practicing, refining, continuing in a way that did not depend on him being there. And instead of feeling excluded from that, he understood it, accepted it. And as he stepped out into the late afternoon light, the city stretching out before him once more, it no longer felt like the only world he existed in. And somewhere between the rhythm he had learned to follow and the silence he had learned to respect, something had begun to change, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough that it could not be undone. Weeks passed without announcement, without any clear moment where everything changed, and yet everything did, quietly, steadily, in the spaces between what was said and what was understood, and on a cool evening that carried the soft hum of the city settling into night. A small theater tucked between familiar streets filled with a different kind of audience, not the loud, impatient crowd of luxury restaurants, but people who watched with intention, who waited, who listened, and backstage. Isabella stood in front of a mirror that did not flatter, did not distort, simply reflected, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her breathing slow, steady, the kind of calm that came not from confidence alone, but from knowing exactly who she was in that moment. And somewhere in the audience, not in the front row reserved for donors or names that carried weight, but a few rows back, seated without announcement, without recognition, Alexander Hayes adjusted his jacket slightly, not out of habit, but because he was aware of himself in a way he had not been before, aware that he was not here to observe, not here to evaluate, but simply to witness. And when the lights dimmed, the room shifted, the quiet growing deeper, more focused, and the music began, not abruptly, but like a breath being drawn in unison, and Isabella stepped onto the stage, not as someone stepping into a role, but as someone returning to a place that had always been hers. And she did not search the audience, did not look for familiar faces, because she did not need to. And yet, for a fraction of a second, her gaze moved across the room and found him, not because she was looking, but because she knew he would be there, and there was no surprise in it, no hesitation, just a brief acknowledgement that passed between them like a quiet understanding. And then she moved, and the dance that followed was not the same as the one in the restaurant, not sharper, not more impressive, but deeper, more complete, every step carrying not just precision, but meaning. And Alexander watched, not analyzing, not comparing, just present, his attention steady, his thoughts quiet in a way they had not been in years. And when the music reached its peak, when her movement slowed into that final moment of stillness, the room did not hesitate this time. The applause rising immediately, not overwhelming, but genuine, and Isabella bowed, not for approval, but as acknowledgement. And when she stepped off the stage, the noise of the audience fading behind her, she did not rush, did not seek out anyone. She simply walked, the same way she always had, steady, composed. And when she stepped outside into the night, the air cool against her skin, she was not surprised to see him there, leaning slightly against the railing of a quiet rooftop just beyond the theater, the city stretching out behind him, familiar and distant at the same time. And for a moment, they stood without speaking, the silence between them no longer uncertain, no longer needing to be filled. And Alexander was the one who spoke first, his voice quieter than it had ever been, stripped of everything unnecessary. You did not need me to be there. And it was not a question, not a statement of doubt, just recognition. And Isabella stepped closer, not closing the distance entirely, but enough to change it, her gaze steady, her expression calm. No, she said softly, but I wanted you to understand. And the words settled between them, simple, clear, and Alexander held her gaze. The weight of everything that had passed between them reflected not in what they had said, but in what they had learned. And for the first time, he did not try to define it, did not try to place it within a structure he could control. He simply accepted it, and he reached out, not abruptly, not with certainty, but with intention, his hand pausing just long enough to give her the choice. And when she did not step away, when her hand met his without hesitation, the moment did not feel like a conclusion. It felt like a beginning, quiet, unspoken, but real, and the city moved around them, lights shifting, sounds rising and falling, but none of it interrupted what had formed there, not something dramatic, not something that demanded attention, but something steady, something built on respect, on understanding, on the absence of pretense. And as they stood there, side by side, looking out at a world that had once defined them both in different ways, it became clear that neither of them needed to change who they were to meet the other. They only needed to see clearly, to listen, to move when the moment asked them to. And in that quiet space, without announcement, without expectation, they chose each other, not as roles, not as symbols, but as two people who had learned, finally, how to recognize what mattered before it was gone. And neither of them tried to say more than that, because they understood something now that could not be explained, only lived, and the night held it gently, without needing anything else. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, share the video, and share with us where you are watching from, and subscribe to When He Chose Her channel for more powerful and emotional journeys like this. Your support helps us bring more meaningful stories to life, stories that remind us that dignity, love, and truth always find their way.